Welcome to Rails-to-Trails Conservancy's webinar and Making the Most of Funding Opportunities in the Infrastructure Bill. I'm Kevin Mills, Vice President of Policy at Rails-to-Trails, and with me today are three members of our federal policy team: Marianne Fowler, the Senior Policy Strategist; Mary Ellen Koontz, the Manager of Trail Funding Advocacy; and Patrick Woyan, Director of Government Relations. Behind the curtain, Sophie Mangasarian, our Advocacy Coordinator, will be providing you with tips and resources in the chat. You can put your questions in the Q&A box at any time, and we'll seek to address them during the Q&A portion of the webinar. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law that was passed in November included a 5-year reauthorization of federal surface transportation policy. And it provides several $100 billion more in transportation funding than would have been the case under funding levels in the FAST Act, as well as it provides policy changes that could help in efforts to elevate the priority given to trails, walking, and biking in the overall transportation system. Our purpose today in this webinar is to help you prepare to take advantage of these new policies and resources. And you may have heard that Congress has not reached agreement on a federal budget for the fiscal year that started last October, and that without that budget, some of the new investments in infrastructure law cannot yet take effect. And that's true, but we think it's prudent to prepare as though the political impasse will be resolved sooner or later. And we're also working to influence the implementation of policy changes, such as the curb to transfers of transportation alternatives funds by the states, advocating for specific appropriations, such as active transportation connectivity funding, and organizing in localities and regions to take advantage of the advance appropriation in the infrastructure law for the RAISE program. RAISE stands for Rebuilding American Infrastructure for Sustainability and Equity. It's a renaming of the program that was formerly known as Build and Tiger, and the Department of Transportation issued a notice of funding opportunity for RAISE with applications due by April 14th. And RTC believes that this is your best opportunity yet to secure concentrated funding to connect trails and other facilities to provide low-stress routes to everyday destinations and neighboring communities. That's why we encourage you to review the resources on the DOT's website, take advantage of sessions that DOT is convening to explain the application process, and then to listen in to our next webinar in 2 weeks, where we will feature successful applicants from last year who will share their insights into how their trail and active transportation plans and projects came out on top in the process. Now, RAISE is an extremely competitive program, but the time to apply is now because there's more money available, favorable new criteria, and we have proof from the unprecedented success of trails and complete streets projects in the November RAISE grant cycle that the current decision makers at US DOT really understand the impact of active transportation. So now we're going to turn to the panel, and I want to start with Patrick Woyan addressing an overview of federal funding opportunities, both new and old, in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Patrick?
Great. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start by doing an overview of a lot of the different programs that are available through this infrastructure bill. I'm going to go throw a lot of names at you, throw a lot of different programs. And one thing I want to stress is that it's really important for you to keep watching our emails, watching the information that you get from Rails-to-Trails Conservancy, because as these programs are rolled out, as they flesh out the details, the rules for these different programs, we'll be sending out more information about what opportunities are available through them. And I'm going to kind of break these down into different categories. Well, first a little bit of an overview about the bill itself. Is that this Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, is the latest of a long series of federal surface transportation bills, and it sets new policy, new priorities based on the goals of the current administration, the Biden administration, and the current and members of Congress. And it provides $284 billion in new surface transportation spending, so it's meant to really be an infusion of resources into our federal surface transportation programs. Within that bill are several new opportunities for trails and active transportation, and these are the categories I started to talk about. The first is about existing programs that focus on trails and active transportation. And then the second is there's a lot of new programs that focus on the priorities of the administration and Congress. The two kind of areas that we're going to focus on for those new programs are programs that focus on connectivity and equity, and then programs that focus on safety and sustainability. So addressing, in particular, addressing climate change and the growing number of pedestrian and bicyclist fatalities. So next slide. So I'll start by talking about the dedicated active transportation funding opportunities. And the first two of these are the programs that you all know and love that we've had in place for about the last 31 years now, since ICE-T passed in 1991. Transportation Alternatives, formerly known as Transportation Enhancements, and the Recreational Trails Program. We're going to talk a little bit more about and dig more into transportation alternatives and the changes that are in the Transportation Alternatives Program this go around. But one thing that's important for you to know is that there is an increase in the bill and funding for transportation alternatives. That if there is an appropriations bill passed and they do fully fund the new infrastructure bill, which we'll also talk a little bit more about, that will provide a significant infusion of new resources of about 70% increase in the program. It's scheduled to start a little over $1.4 billion, an increase to well over $1.5 billion by the end of the 5-year period of the bill. The Recreational Trails Program, unfortunately, does not have an increase in this time around. And there's a long story behind that, but basically what it does, what the bill does is it requires there to be a report done analyzing the amount of revenue coming from motorized recreational vehicles, which is meant to be dedicated for the Recreational Trails Program. That report has actually already been done and was released by the Federal Highway Administration around the time that the bill was passed, but unfortunately was not in time to be reflected in the amount. So that is staying at $84 million per year right now. And then the third of these dedicated active transportation funding opportunities is the Active Transportation Infrastructure Investment Program, which we sometimes call ATIP as its acronym, or just a connectivity grant program. And that has been an important priority for Rails-to-Trails Conservancy to get this passed for several years now. What it does is it provides targeted, focused investment in communities through a competitive grant program. So communities that are interested in obtaining funds through this program would apply directly to the United States Department of Transportation along the lines of the RAISE grant program, formerly known as BUILD, formerly known as TIGER, which is a national competitive program where everybody can apply across the country, and it's incredibly competitive. What this does, as opposed to RAISE, is that this is money focused on connected active transportation infrastructure, so trail and active transportation networks. So that communities that have been working for years, as many of your communities probably have been for years, on trying to build up the resources that they need to provide connected networks of active transportation, can apply to this program instead of getting smaller amounts of money over many, many years through the Transportation Alternatives or Recreational Trails programs, can get a significant infusion of resources to be able to plan and complete those networks. That program, unfortunately, was authorized in the bill, which means that the pot was created to establish that program, but unfortunately, it was not yet appropriated for. There is no money currently in that program until an appropriations bill is passed that includes the money. So the pot is created, and now we're trying to work with appropriations, with the appropriations process to fill that pot. So there's a lot here in terms of those are the programs that are dedicated funding for trails and active transportation. There are a number of programs in the bill that are eligible where trails and active transportation are ineligible projects that could be funded through those programs. And first raise, that's Kevin spoke about that before. And we will be having talking more about that in our webinar in a couple of weeks, and talking about how you can make sure you're competitive for that program. But that is a program that has existed, that a lot of communities have applied for and already used for our trails and active transportation. Then the Reconnecting Communities pilot program. This is a new program that's funded in the bill at $1 billion per year. That is meant to, as the title suggests, as the name suggests, to reconnect communities. And it really looks at communities that historically have been divided by infrastructure projects, large highway projects, aqueducts, train tracks, things that divide and separate communities from one another, and trying to rebuild and weave those communities back together with the neighborhoods around them. This is an important equity priority for the Biden administration. Because as he has spoken about, as Secretary Buttigieg has spoken about, the communities that were destroyed, divided by infrastructure in the past were largely communities of color, low-income communities, and this is about trying to revitalize those communities. Trails and active transportation are an eligible and a critical part of this reconnection. And is really one thing that we're encouraging communities to do is look at what opportunities are available for these types of neighborhoods, these communities that have been divided, to weave them back into other surrounding communities through use of trails, through use of safe infrastructure for walking and biking. The next program is the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program. It's a long existing program. It's a large program that's very flexible for different projects. Trails and active transportation are eligible and have been eligible. The next is the Safe Streets for All program. And I put this together with an existing program called the Highway Safety Improvement Program. Safe Streets for All is a new program that's dedicating $5 billion towards safe streets plans. It's being tied in with the Highway Safety Improvement program because that program, which currently exists and is used to fund usually spot improvements to help improve the safety on roadways for pedestrians and cyclists. That program is being improved in the new bill to require that states and communities institute vulnerable road user plans. And Safe Streets for All can be used to create those vulnerable road user plans, to create safety plans in communities, and also complements the Highway Safety Improvement Program to be able to actually implement full plans for bicycle and pedestrian safety. We highlight that with Rails-to-Trails Conservancy in part because we strongly believe that trails and separated infrastructure is the best way to make sure that people can, or often at least the best way to make sure that pedestrians and cyclists can safely get from one place to another. So that trails separated infrastructure should be a part of any vulnerable road user plan. Safe Routes to School is a new program that existed in the past, was eliminated in MAP 21, and now is being reestablished in this new bipartisan infrastructure law. Safe Routes to School is now an eligible expenditure, providing safe avenues for people to get to, now it's not just elementary school, but middle schools and high schools as well. And it's an eligible expenditure. There is no dedicated funding specifically within the Safe Routes to School program, but it's meant to provide some more flexibility and it will be implemented in a way that is encouraging communities to really invest in safe routes to school. We again believe that trails and separated infrastructure should be an important part of any safe plan here. The carbon reduction program is focused on climate change. We also want to encourage you all as our partners to work with your communities to make sure that trails, that active transportation and mode shift to active transportation is an important part of local greenhouse gas reduction, emission reduction plans. And that ties in, of course, with the congestion mitigation and air quality improvement program, another existing program that has been used to address greenhouse gas emissions and general air quality in communities around the country. So next slide. You can hear the theme that we have here is really focused on trail and active transportation connectivity. Connectivity is really the way that communities can achieve a lot of their other goals, making sure that when you're thinking about building out active transportation infrastructure, that you're connecting it to the places that people want to go on an everyday basis. That's the best way to achieve our objectives for safety, for reducing bicycle and pedestrian fatalities, for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and improving the quality of our air, and also for achieving important goals around equity, around making sure that historically disadvantaged and underinvested communities that now currently typically face a higher rate of pedestrian and bicyclist fatalities because they haven't seen investment in safe places to walk and bike. That addressing those goals, the best way to do all three of those goals is through through connectivity. In the last couple of years, we've had introduced the Connecting America's Active Transportation System Act. It's currently was introduced last year as Senate Bill 684 and House Resolution 2991. That is what the Active Transportation Infrastructure Investment Program was modeled after. That would have provided $500 million a year for regional networks and spines between communities. The Active Transportation Infrastructure Investment Program, as I mentioned before, it authorizes that program, the connectivity grant program, at $200 million a year, not the $500 million we had asked for, but it's at least a start, and that is subject to appropriations. With the sorry, actually, can you just go back for 1 second? Sorry. We also are continuing to monitor the Build Back Better Act, which also includes some significant programs that would fund active transportation infrastructure. You probably have all heard about that in the news, so I won't go into it too much, but we're hoping that that's not dead and that's still another opportunity that we could have more about in the future. So, okay. Next slide, there we go. So the Recreational Trails program I mentioned before is being kept steady at $84 million per year. I already talked a little bit about this, but keep an eye. We'll share more information in the months ahead about how we're working to get more funding to the Recreational Trails program. And with that, I will turn it over to Mary Ellen to talk more about the changes to the Transportation Alternatives Program.
Thanks so much, Patrick. The Transportation Alternatives Program, as Patrick mentioned, is the largest source of funding for trails, walking, and biking. These federal dollars are allocated to all 50 states and DC to then administer and obligate to projects through both the state MPOs, or both the state DOT and MPOs, depending on the size of the community. While there are 10 eligibilities for the TA program, we've found that about 95% or more goes to pedestrian and bicycle facilities as well as trails. So that's a really huge percent of this really important program going to all of the things we know and love. Control my own slides. Okay, so the bill provides, as Patrick mentioned as well, about a 70% increase over 5 years. That averages out to a little over $1.4 billion per year, and up to, and that will be phased in. This really gives states the opportunity to prioritize network completion, connectivity, and equitable access because it's such a huge infusion of funds. I'll just make a note that we are hearing that because of the current state of the budget and the appropriations process, states are in a bit of a holding pattern until that new budget is passed, which is when the obligation limitations, which means how much of their federal share states are able to spend, will rise to meet new bill levels. If you're hearing any differently, I will just flag that you can email me, and I'd love to have a conversation about that, just so that we're all on the same page and RTC is kind of collecting that internal knowledge. There are two really important policy changes within the Transportation Alternatives Program. The first one is that states can now use up to 5% of their TA dollars to work on technical assistance. The second is a limitation on transfers. If you've joined our previous transportation alternatives webinars, you know that transfers tend to be a large issue in states. And it's really diverted a huge amount of funding away from TA since the program was created. And really since MAP 21 was passed a little over a decade ago. So these two policy changes are really critically important for the TA program and for all of you, because they should allow more communities to access more funding. And with that, I will turn it over to Marianne, who will wrap us up.
There we go. That should have it. Thank you, Mary Ellen. First of all, I want to say, just listening to us talk here about all the wonderful new opportunities, new funding, new eligibilities that we have in Bill, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Our core programs, Transportation Alternatives Program and the Rec-Trails Program, have been with us for 31 years, as Patrick mentioned. And we wouldn't have those programs still. We wouldn't have these increasing numbers if you all had not been, you all out there in the country had not been very, very wise about the projects that you selected to be funded. It is the value of those projects that has propelled this movement and has allowed us to continue in Congress to get the funding, again, to return to the states. But that doesn't mean that we can't have improvements, particularly with all of these new opportunities. So it's really important that you think strategically about how you're going to maneuver your project into receiving funding under Bill. And I wish I could say there was one strategy that fits all for every state, but there's not. So we have to be a little customized here. But some things to think about in terms of a strategy are to consider the full life cycle costs when you are preparing your project application, whether it's going to TAP or whether it's going to Rec-Trails or whether it's going to one of the eligibilities in another program. Because people making these decisions want to, if they're at their best, they're looking at these projects holistically, and they don't want to fund something that's going to fall off a cliff at the end of the funding for that particular project. Sometimes there's a requirement in your state that you be included in a STIP or a TIP. That's the planning documents for the area in which you live. If you're not in there, it's not the end of the world. Sometimes these can be quickly amended, but that is a step that you need to consider in planning your strategy. If you have been, or even if you have not been, a recipient of previous TAP or Rec-Trail grants, look at those other Bill programs really carefully to see whether there's a potential fit for what you want to do. One of the things that happens is, and we've gotten many a call about this, which is, wow, I've gotten 5 TA grants and 1 Rec-Trails grant, and the word is that my community's not going to get any more for a while. Well, if that's where you are, look at those other programs, see if you can craft your application to satisfy those eligibilities. Another really key part of your strategy is to know your state programs and the politics of your programs and how they are run. There are 50 different ways of, oh, excuse me, Kevin corrected you earlier, 51 different ways of doing this. We figured out there are 50 ways to leave your lover, but 51 ways in which you run your transportation alternatives and Rec-Trails programs. So it's really important that you know how they're run, and you can find that out by going to their websites or some of the websites here on the links that we're going to send you after this is after the webinar is completed. Some states, more and more states make merit-based decisions in awarding these grants. But some of them are still on sort of the old model, which is kind of where a lot of states started, which is political decisions. They want to make sure they're spread around, going to the right people. One of my early experiences, I went into a congressional office when ICE-T first passed, and we had transportation enhancements was the name then. And I sat down with the chief of staff and I started talking about the program, how important it could be to their state. And he acted like he didn't know what I was talking about, no familiar with the program. And finally I said, look, I just think you're being disingenuous with me. I think you really know, or maybe you don't know what transportation enhancements are. And he said, don't know, what do you mean? And he said, you just wait right here. He got up and he ran to another office and he came back with one of those yellow legal pads and he said, let me read you the list of what's going to be funded in our state. So that was a political decision, had already been made. So some of that still continues. You need to have a feel for that. I think the goal is to continue to move more and more toward merit-based decisions. Another key tip here is to review current TA and RTP project lists, which are available through these links. Look and see what types of projects your program typically funds. What do they like and what are they not funding? So torque your application so that it fits nicely with the kinds of things your state wants to fund. And another really important thing is the obligation rate in your state. And what that means is of the money available for this program, how much of it is your state actually spending? Because if your state has a really low obligation rate for transportation alternatives or rec trails, which is less usual, that means that money is being spent someplace else. That's a deliberate decision. You can turn that decision around. And that should be a part of your strategy also. Next slide, Mary Ellen. And so always connect your project and what you're doing with your elected officials early and often. I'm not recommending that you vote early and often, but that you have contact early and often, because ultimately the decision on whether to continue these programs will depend particularly on the federal level officials. And if they know what the program has funded at home, if they see the benefit, if they see the support of their constituents, our job, or our collective job in going through the next reauthorization will be ever so much easier. And so make sure your plans and our documents are ready for use in the next reauthorization. And now who does it go back to? Or do we go to questions from here?
We do go to questions from here. So we can take the slides down, get the whole panel up. And I know some great questions are already rolling in, so we'll just jump right into it. Thank you, panelists. So the first question is about planning and design. And there's a specific question about that related to RAISE and then just more generally. So basically, which programs can be used to support planning and design. I will say, as to RAISE, there is absolutely a category of funding for planning projects, and we will feature a successful applicant for a planning grant as part of our webinar in a couple of weeks. So please come back and hear more about that. But panel, any other thoughts about how someone would go about being strategic in getting their planning design phases funded?
Well, I think that making sure that that there is an understanding of the full value of the project and what that's going to bring to the community is really important, because why do planning and design if it's not of value? So even though that's not what you're asking for funding for, having that as part of your application, either in a cover letter or in maybe a conversation, some other means, is really important. Keep in mind that this time around with this 5% on TA, talking about TA here, for technical assistance, that means that's going to establish an interactive process between applicants and your state agency that's administering the program. So that gives you a chance also to expound upon the greater value or the long-term value of the project.
Any other panelists want to speak to this issue? All right, so second question is a very specific one, which is how we would define spine. So I'll take a whack at this. So in the Connecting America's Active Transportation System Act, which was the bill introduced in both the House and the Senate that ended up being translated into this active transportation infrastructure investment program that was authorized, it speaks of networks and spines. So networks refers to within a region, the connectivity to routine destinations and what have you. The spine referred to the connection between communities and ultimately across state lines. And so these are these dedicated connections, typically longer distance that goes between communities, between regions, and between states. So the third question has to do with a couple of questions about maintenance and how you get maintenance funded. And of course, some allusions in other questions to different kinds of maintenance, renovation level, routine, and so on. So panelists, please comment on how you would go about getting maintenance of a trail funded.
Well, if you were applying through the Recreational Trails program, I would go right to the law in the code and look at the permissible uses. The first 3 permissible uses speak directly to maintenance. And I believe the 5th one does also, and there's one further down. But it's not the routine of cutting the grass. It's maintenance that's more designed to improve the trail, or if a trail has seriously aged out and needs restoration, or if there is an environmental issue that has developed because of repeated trail use, which is a good thing, but things wear out. And so that's the kind of maintenance that can be funded through the Rec Trails program. Again, different states have different standards. It's really good to find out what your state has done in the past and whether what you have in mind fits that profile or whether you want to push the envelope a little bit for something else.
Within the Transportation Alternatives Program, there's some very, very specific rules about using the funds for maintenance at the federal level. Major resurfacing is really the only area that you'll see a use for maintenance. And that's at the federal level. As Marianne said, the states administer funds in their own unique ways. I'm not familiar with many states that actually allow TA funds to be used for maintenance because the code is so specific at the federal level, but it is something that TA managers in other states could explore.
And a lot of these other programs too are really just meant for new construction, but if there is something, if it's a trail that's really run down, that's been torn up, that really needs that maintenance to basically be fully resurfaced, and it's almost effectively like building a new trail, then it could qualify under a number of these other programs as well, like the Active Transportation Infrastructure Investment Program.
Just don't call it maintenance. Call it restoration. Call it reconnecting communities. Calling it safety. We have to put a bridge here because of a safety reason.
Or call it rebuilding.
Yes, language is so key in all of this.
Very true.
Okay, thank you. So we have a follow-up question on the spine question about basically what couldn't go on these spines. And so just want to clarify that the intent is this is for active transportation. It's walking, it's biking, it's not for motor vehicles. So with that, let's turn to there are multiple safety oriented questions. I think it's going to be a critical topic. We just saw a very impressive national roadway safety strategy issued by the U.S. Department of Transportation. There's some interest in understanding how that relates to these new resources. And there's also a specific question about Safe Streets for All and how any resources that flow from that work, how do they actually get down to the implementation level? Who would like to take that? Patrick?
Sure. Well, I'll talk about the Safe Streets and Roads for All program. That is a competitive grant program that will go to local governments and MPOs. So that does not go through the state. So that is an opportunity for local governments to engage directly directly with the Department of Transportation to implement some of the things that are in the National Roadway Safety Strategy. I'll mention about the National Roadway Safety Strategy is that it does not specifically mention trails and greenways, but it does provide an opportunity by focusing on your system solutions and your safe systems, on your engineering solutions, and looking at how communities are built. It does open the door more for trails to be used as a tool for safety. So I think there's a great opportunity here for local activists to engage with your local governments and to make sure that safety strategies that they're getting funded now through the Safe Streets and Roads for All program are inclusive of trails.
All right. Any other thoughts on safety issues from other panelists? Okay. So let's talk a little bit more generally. There's other questions that relate to how money gets down to the local level. So maybe we can explain for different programs how that works. So for instance, RAISE are direct US DOT grants can be direct grants to localities. But Mary Ellen, in the case of transportation alternatives, how does that work? It's very different.
So the Transportation Alternatives Program is run really differently than RAISE in many regards, but especially when it comes to how different communities can access the funds. There's a provision, the TA program really splits into two buckets at the state level. There's a set aside for metropolitan planning organizations serving communities over 200,000. Many states keep that funding completely separate and ask that those projects within that footprint apply directly to the MPO and not to the state funds, in order to open up the state funds to more rural communities or smaller urban and suburban communities as well. So that can vary a lot state by state. I'd encourage you to look at RTC's Transportation Alternatives Data Exchange, or TRADE. We're working right now on updating all of those state profiles, and that will help you understand if your state allows you, if you're within the MPO, if your state allows you to apply for funds directly to the state or through the MPO.
Great, thank you. So there've been questions about matching funds. So the general rule in transportation world is that a project can be 80% federal and needs a 20% state or local match. Are there any exceptions to that in the bill that people would be interested to know about? Patrick, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So so some of the equity-based programs, especially the Reconnecting Communities program, offers an exception to that can be funded fully through federal dollars. The other big exception, and I think Marianne may understand this better than I do, is that the Recreational Trails program can sometimes be used as federal dollars that provide a local match.
Yes, the Rec Trails program can be used. Those are federal dollars, but those federal dollars can be used to match any other program that has similar eligibilities, any other federal program that has set up similar eligibilities. It's very, very flexible in so many different ways.
Right. So the next question has to do with those federally administered programs, RAISE, Reconnecting Communities. Is there any limit on how much any given state can receive? Patrick, do you want to take that?
For which program? I missed the beginning.
Well, say RAISE and Reconnecting Communities, right? Because what would happen in the case of transportation alternatives is there would be an allocation given to each state, and then the state would administer those funds. So in the case of the federally administered programs,
right? So
how do they think about spreading it around?
And there isn't for Reconnecting Communities. There's not a limit per state, although I'm sure that since it's a competitive grant program and it's a limited number of funds, they're not going to want to put it all to one state. For RAISE, there is a limit. I'm trying to remember what it is in terms of rural versus urban. It's not. and don't believe it's specifically laid out that there's a limit per state, but I know that their goal with that is to 50-50. Somebody just reminded me that is 50-50 for rural versus urban. So the goal there is really to get it to be spread out in a geographically diverse range. They're not gonna give it to one state, and I think and usually, I mean, we encourage you, if you're going to be applying for a RAISE grant, to always reach out to your U.S. senators, your members of Congress, to talk about what other priorities they have, because if you're competing against other local priorities, then your chance of getting funding is going to be lower. So work with them to try to make sure that your project is in the top of their priority list.
Yeah, certainly over time, the RAISE and previously Build and Tiger, but that program has benefited really every part of the country, and I do think that's part of its political appeal, is that everybody can see themselves in it, at least over time. Okay, so there's another question about reconnecting communities, whether we could fund trails as a means of reconnecting communities, and I'll take that one. So not only can a trail be a way to mitigate that division of those historic transportation structures under reconnecting communities, but within the Build Back Better Act, which is pending in Congress, and it's a whole nother story about crystal balling about that. But I would just say, as a policy matter, the additional funds for reconnecting communities within that bill was twinned with the active transportation connectivity idea, and so those were seen as being very simpatico policy provisions that could reinforce each other. So,
don't we
yes.
have some examples already where major highways have come down and trails have been used as one of the mechanisms for reconnecting those communities that were divided by those highway infrastructures in the past, like the Lafitte corridor in New Orleans is one that comes to mind, and I think there was one underway in Minneapolis. So the precedent is there already. Making sure that it continues to be thought of as one of the essential components is part of our job.
I want to correct something I just said. I didn't misspeak. There is a total state maximum for RAISE. It's $225 million. That I don't believe that high of a number has ever come into play in one particular state. It might have in California, but I'd have to check.
Right.
But that's a lot. I mean, generally, I think it's more that if there's a key priority project for a state or a couple of key priority projects, they're likely to get funded. So it's important to get your project high on that priority list.
Yeah, thank you. So here's a question about communities with limited resources, whether that be small towns or it be, say, low-income neighborhoods. How can they be competitive in the grant process? How do we overcome the particular challenges for those communities?
So I think there's a couple of things that this bill tries to do to address that, and one is in terms of trying to get out there is a priority within this administration to try to provide more assistance and resources for low-income communities, communities of color in particular, to be able to manage the grant process, and part of it is, as Mary Ellen mentioned, the 5%. That states can spend on technical assistance with the Transportation Alternatives Grant, but the administration is also very actively reaching out to communities to make sure that communities have the resources they need to apply for other grant programs as well, and I encourage folks who are looking at projects in those particular communities to keep an eye out for those resources, to engage with your local Department of Transportation offices, your members of Congress, again to see what opportunities are available there. But there are other opportunities where traditionally disadvantaged communities might have more of an opportunity we had tried to get actually in the Active Transportation Infrastructure Investment Program a lower match requirement. We were not successful in getting that included, but there is still a prioritization within that program for disadvantaged communities, and a lot of the other ones do as well. Specifically within the statutory language, that should be a focus, that they should be considered more competitive.
When IC was first passed, the state of Maryland, Patrick being mayor of College Park, had I thought, absolutely wonderful approach. They did an analysis of their entire state and what the economic richness, shall we say, of each of their different areas was. And that if you were affluent, you had a higher match. And if you were non-affluent, you had no match. And so it equaled out. At some point in history, Maryland dropped that approach, which was, I thought, sort of too bad, because I thought that was a really good model. Another approach that I don't know if this is, I know some states tried it, I don't know the status of it right now, is that, again, by using those statistical, area definitions of what, well-defined and accepted definitions of economically stressed communities, that for those communities, the state would use state funds for the matches for those communities, as opposed to requiring that the local come up with the match. So if that's a problem or an issue in your state, I think that's a really good discussion to have with your DOT about how you should address it.
All right. Okay, so here's a question just came in, which is about, is there a downside to perusing different funding sources for the same project? Marianne, you gave that a little giggle. What do you say?
We're hoping actually that when the guidance for all these 7 new programs comes out, that they will have them clumped for similar eligibilities, if you will. And that, so when applying for those, you won't apply for a specific program, but you'll put in your application and it might have eligibility under a number of them. And that will, so you won't have the problem of deciding where it best fits. The people making the decisions on what to fund will have that to grapple with. It's dicey. It's a sort of a political decision. I think that transparency is the most important thing. And I think also keeping track of the timing of the deadlines for both applying and the awarding of grants is very important. So that people in some of the federal grants are going to be decided before the state grants, you might be very open with your state people saying, we've applied for this federal grant, but if we don't get it, there's still time for you to consider us in your decisions for the state grants. You just, again, each state will be a different puzzle. This is a part of what I meant about knowing how your programs work in your state and then interfacing those with the federal programs. Kevin, you know more about what FHWA, what their current thinking on the guidance of grouping programs, similar programs, or programs with similar goals and objectives together, how that's going.
I'm not sure I know the latest, but I'd say that because of the sheer number of new programs stood up in the infrastructure law, there is a recognition that there's some value in thinking about how could you make this more coherent from the applicant standpoint, right? Because it's really, and also that makes it more approachable from DOT's standpoint if there's not so many different things to stand up and run completely siloed from other things. And so I think an effort to make that all a bit more seamless and have like programs, maybe even have a common call and then a sorting out of where those resources should come from, which could be a could be a strategy, but there's certainly been no official word about what they will do in those regards. I think these are just some of the kinds of strategic conversations that this law has prompted.
Yeah. So one thing that the administration has done is appointed Mitch Landrieu to be sort of the infrastructure czar, and part of the goal with that is really to help communities to look at what all these different programs and help figure out what the best programs are, which project might fit in which slot. They're also encouraging the states each to appoint their own infrastructure czars to assist local communities, since Mitch Landrieu isn't going to be able to do everything, to help local communities to navigate which programs are best for which projects. So I would encourage you to find out within your state if they've appointed an infrastructure czar, and how the state DOT might be able to help you navigate the different programs.
All right, I've got a question about phasing. And I think the idea here is that, we've already spoken about, can you use these funding sources for things like planning and design and later construction, what have you. I think the question here is, if you were, for instance, to go and get a RAISE grant for planning at one point in time, would it be viable for you, not just allowed, but viable for you to go back later and seek a construction grant? And let me begin and answer, and then see who would like to add to it, which is that I think as part of the department elevating equity, they recognize that some communities have had trouble getting to the same point as maybe some other communities in terms of how fully developed their plans are, and whether they've been able to invest the resources to get those articulated at the level where they can win the competition for a construction grant. And so I think this commitment for equity could very well translate into a much more intentional strategy to support places to take the step that they're ready to take now. So that's my thought, but what do other panelists?
I think with regard to state-based programs, the short answer is yes. Programs that are administered through the state, especially, if you get a RAISE grant, yes, please apply for a transportation alternatives grant for construction. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the states focus very specifically on using TA dollars to fund construction projects. It's a little bit faster for them to get out the door, which means that it's just a little bit, it keeps the wheels greased a little bit more at their level, and they're reporting to their higher ups. So yeah, I think we've got some interesting webinars, some really cool webinars coming down the pike from RTC later this year as well, that will really focus on how to make that funding strategy. Short answer is yes, long answer, stay tuned for more on kind of how to maximize that.
Thank you.
If there's a prohibition on, just sort of double dipping within RAISE, first for planning and then for implementation, construction, I don't know of it. I don't think there is. But what I would say is if you go in for a planning and design grant, you should have some idea of how you want to then implement the results of that planning and design. And if it is your intention to go back to RAISE for additional funding, then you should be interacting with your members of Congress and senators so that when they appropriate the money for RAISE on the next round, that there's perhaps an ambiguity in that area could be cleared up.
Great, thank you. So there is a question about why have we said that RAISE is a particularly good opportunity this particular round? And I'll take this as foreshadowing a bit about our webinar in a couple of weeks, right? But what we see, a number of things. One is there's more money available than before. Another is that the criteria are really a good fit for trail, walking and biking facilities. They focus on safety. There's a focus on equity. There's a focus on climate and environmental sustainability and quality of life. These are some of the criteria that will help projects rise to the top. And these all are great fits for what you all provide. And then the November grant round was so successful for trails and for complete streets and vulnerable user safety that it's quite obvious that the decision makers at USDOT for this program right now fully get what the contribution is of active transportation to what they're trying to achieve. So just to put a little numbers behind that, this is a multimodal program. It supports ports and roads and bridges and transit. But in the last round, 19% of the funding went to trails, another 21% went to complete streets. And so, fully 40% of this multimodal program went to things that are relevant to walking, biking. And so that was really unprecedented and really speaks well to what we provide compared to what it is that the department is looking to achieve. So we are strongly encouraging folks to apply, and that's why we're having a special dig in deep session in a couple of weeks about that, where we'll be able to feature the people who had success in that last round and how they think they got there. There's another question about whether it's RAISE or Reconnecting Communities. If there's a regional project, does it make sense for communities to go into it together, officially go in and apply together? Thoughts on that? Anyway.
I think it depends on the program. There are some that were specifically multiple governments or consortiums of governments can be eligible. I think MPO applications oftentimes can be stronger than individual local government applications for a program, because it does show more regional buy-in for a project. So I think it can. It depends a little bit on the program.
I think my understanding is that for RAISE, even if you're not part of an MPO, you can submit an application with other communities and local governments. You'll need to identify one as the lead, but it is certainly possible.
Okay. There is a question for Marianne about what is next for the Recreational Trails program and advocacy on behalf of it.
Well, the failure to increase the level of 84 million a year funding for rec trails, particularly in light of the findings of the fuel study, which came out the very day that the bill was being voted on. So as Patrick said earlier, it was too late to incorporate those results, but that, the finding was that it was $281 million a year that the motorized trails community is contributing to the Highway Trust Fund with its gas receipts. So the Coalition for Recreational Trails has taken a few actions. The first has been a discussion with DOT, basically saying you should fix this. Whether DOT is going to fix it or not, we don't know. There are commitments to look at it seriously and try to see what they can do. We're not, in this total scheme of things, on a $1.2 trillion bill, we're not talking about a whole lot more money, and it could come from various places. So that's the first point of approach. It's been with DOT, which is, can you fix this? The second point of approach will be in the appropriations process for the 2023 budget, the work on which has maybe sort of begun, but it's a little hard for them to begin working on the 2023 budget when they're still stuck in the 2022 budget. But assuming that DOT does not, in the president's budget, does not have a solution to the funding level, then we will move to the appropriations committees and negotiate there for an increase in that funding. But we would do that not because of the strange way that bill is structured. We have to be careful that it's not done at the expense of one of our other programs, particularly since rec trails and transportation alternatives are housed together in the transportation alternatives program. So we have to, it's a little dicey the way the structure of the bill works, that we're not robbing Peter to pay Paul. Or was it robbing Paul to pay Peter? Can't remember.
All right. Well, we are at time. I thank all the panelists for your insights. And just as we close, there is a closing question about, what to expect in terms of timing on implementation. And, we will say that there's an interesting juxtaposition of Congress working towards a fiscal 22 budget right now. And some of these programs, as has been mentioned, we are looking to the fiscal 23 appropriations process as the opportunity to fill the pots with money and make them go. So there's definitely some uncertainties about these things. We will say with confidence that USDOT is working diligently to provide guidance and stand up the programs that they can, given where we are in the congressional process, and that they will be, I'm sure, very busy and doing this in phases throughout the year. Any other panelists have closing thoughts about this timeline?
Stay tuned for opportunities that you can help us engage in that.
Absolutely. And again, we encourage you, because this is one of the reasons why we've drawn attention to the RAISE grant process that's underway. Not only is it just a very good immediate opportunity to put your best ideas forward, but it's the thing that's right and before us, and that allows us to start getting money on the ground, making a difference. I saw that just yesterday that this is the first bipartisan infrastructure law federal discretionary grant money that's getting out on the ground. So you want to be part of that that new phase for our movement, and get more done in your community. And thank you for joining us.